Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our Faith and Culture Conversation. My name is Keli Shipley Cooper, and I serve as the Associate of Program Development at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. And again, we are just so glad that you are joining us. This is our final Faith and Culture Conversation, which we started this previous fall. And this is an opportunity for us to discuss different topics that are extremely, well, especially right now, extremely relevant to our society and also to our church itself. So I'm so excited to introduce our two co-facilitators for this evening and for this entire series, which has just been so wonderful. So we have Luckritz Marquis, who is an associate professor of church history at Union Presbyterian Seminary here in Richmond, Virginia. She also serves as the program director of the Master of Theology program as well. And then we have Dave Coogan, who is an associate professor of English at VCU, so Virginia Commonwealth University, also here in Richmond. So again, thank you both so much for serving as our co-facilitators. And before we get started and they will introduce our speaker, I just want to remind you all that you are always encouraged and welcome to use our Q&A function and our chat function to interact with this conversation. And that's located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can click the different buttons. And if at any point you have a specific question, especially with technology, you can chat me directly as well. So I will pass things over to Christine, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much. Well, it is my profound pleasure to introduce to you Jamie Manson. Jamie is president of Catholics for Choice. For over 15 years, she has been a thought leader and advocate in the field of women's equality and reproductive rights in the Catholic Church and the public square. For 12 years, she was a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, where she was one of the few openly LGBTQ journalists in the Catholic media in the whole wide world. She was an often solitary voice for reproductive freedom and justice, and was one of the first to sound the alarm about the right-wing push for religious freedom. Jamie's expertise in Catholicism and sexual ethics was first formed during her studies at Yale with her mentor, which is where I met her, Margaret Farley. She edited and wrote the introduction to Changing the Questions, Explorations in Christian Ethics, a collection of writings by Margaret Farley that was published in 2015. Jamie has published op-eds in the New York Times, NBC Think, Miss Magazine, and Rewire, and has been featured, especially in the last week or so, in dozens of media outlets, including Full Frontal with Samantha Bee. You should watch that one if you haven't. NPR, the LA Times, and CNN. She is the recipient of the Sister Teresa Kane Woman of Vision and Courage Award, and we are just so excited to have you to have this conversation with us this evening. So welcome, Jamie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here, Jamie. We have a lot to talk about tonight. It's going to get heavy politically, but I wanted to start a little bit more organically with you and your faith. Can you tell us a little bit about your faith, what you came to know about your faith, and when you came to know it?
Oh gosh, okay. How much time do we have? Sure. So I was baptized Catholic as an infant. And so I was raised Catholic in an immigrant Italian family in New York. And we were, not very Catholic, not super Catholic, more culturally Catholic, although my grandparents were very pious, but they prayed at home. They did not go to church. They didn't trust the church. And, but I made all my sacraments and all of that. And, when I was about 14, I felt called. I was at Holy Thursday liturgy, and that's a particularly dramatic liturgy in the Feast of Holy Week. And at the end, when there's this procession with the Eucharist, and they're chanting Pange Lingua. It was smoke and drama. It was fantastic. And I'd never seen this before, but I felt this incredible calling in that moment. I felt God was calling me to be a Catholic priest. And this has gone very, very well, as you could imagine. This was a great journey for me in the Catholic Church that bans women's ordination. But that was like the initial calling, and that sort of stayed with me for my entire life. I went on, I studied theology in college, and then I went on to Yale. And that's sort of always been with me. And I think my time at Yale was really important for a number of reasons. But one of them was I went to Yale to get away from the Catholic world. I was Catholic grammar school, Catholic high school, Catholic college. And I was like, finally, I'm going to be among these people called Protestants. This seems wonderful. I heard they ordain women. And, when I got there, it actually, the opposite happened. I started studying with Margaret Farley, who's a Catholic nun. And it was a time for me to really go into a deep 3-year discernment of why I wanted to remain Catholic and keep my Catholic identity. And it allowed me time to give language to why I still call myself a Catholic, but it also gave me a time to decide that, the Catholic Church as an institution is a menace. Really to civil law, to hospitals, to all sorts of institutions, because it constantly overreaches into civil society. And never has there been a time where that is more true than this moment in this country. And so, what I often say is, on my good days, I'm Catholic because I see so much beauty in the tradition, in our sacramental tradition, and our understanding of God and grace, and the way in which grace perfects nature, and we're co-creators with God, and all these great Thomistic ideas. And so I really do, I'm able to give language to why a lot of Catholics who are very unhappy with the church still feel compelled by it. But on my not so good days, I fight the church because, again, of this incredible overreach into politics, into law, into medical care globally, not just in the US. And so, and so it's, I live in a liminal space, I would say, with the church.
Betwixt and between.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, and so you've sort of raised a lot of this, but I wonder if you'd be willing to sort of go a little bit deeper into those maybe not so good days, right? So how do you deal with the struggle between reconciling your faith with the faith or strongly held convictions of these others, especially in your work with reproductive rights, right? That it's a conversation where you have this deep faith on the one hand, but these other people are also claiming a very deep faith, both in the Catholic Church, but also within Christianity more broadly.
Yeah. I think it's really important to recognize that the anti-choice movement is not secular. It is religious. It claims a religious identity. And I think if Roe is in fact struck down, the narrative will be it's a victory for faith, and for religion. And, it's the big lie, honestly, it is the big lie. And I can go into more about why I say that, but that'll take me down a rabbit hole that we're not ready for at this point in the conversation. But it's really, really hard. And I think, if I had a dime for every time I was told I'm not Catholic on Twitter, I could fund my organization for the next 10 years. But it just shows a very shallow understanding, I think, of Catholicism, which is a very complex and sometimes even quite sophisticated theological tradition. And they just reduce it to this one issue, and it's just awful. And it's so much more complex than that. And even the church's history on the teaching is so much more complex than that. That's another big lie they say, is that the Catholic Church's teaching on abortion is unchanged and unchangeable. This is simply false. For the first 1800 plus years, the Catholic Church did not teach that it was murder, but more of a sin against marriage, like many, many other things that people do every day, which they would have considered sin against marriage, contraceptive use, certain kinds of sex. You get the picture. I'll keep this PG. It's really, really hard to see the Catholic faith, as such a reductive approach to the Catholic faith, even a Calvinistic approach to the Catholic faith, I would almost say. Which doesn't, there's so much space in Catholicism for gray areas that I think you don't even get in evangelical traditions, because we have the notion of individual conscience, because we have this incredible social justice tradition and our sacramentality, this idea that God can be anywhere and God is revealing God's self constantly in all things, gives us a lot more ability to think with nuance in this tradition. And you just don't see it with these hardliners.
Mm.
It's interesting the way you talked about the complexity of the Catholic tradition. I think that's something that we might want to hear more about. You said it's a rabbit hole, but I think, Christine, I would go down the rabbit hole, because what I understand is that, like you're saying, there's this evangelical reductive position that Christianity says in this case that abortion is evil or wrong. But the way you're describing it, that there's a lot more history and philosophy and theology in that. Could you talk a little bit more about the cultures, plural, of Christianity, and then how your sense of those cultures interacts with the culture of advocacy for women's right to choose?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about what we at Catholics for Choice call sort of our three pillars of that we employ to make a Catholic case for supporting abortion access. And the first one is that notion that we have of conscience, or the primacy of conscience, which dates way back to Thomas Aquinas, so 1,000 years or so. In which, and the Catechism says, the Catholic Catechism says this, is that we must, in the end, decide with our conscience, and that our individual conscience is the final arbiter in all moral decision making. That's good Catholic teaching, and that includes, going against law and against church teaching. And so we have that because we have this understanding of reason, in the Catholic tradition, and that reason is a gift from God, and using our reason is to use the gift of God. And Thomas Aquinas said, to go against your conscience is in a way to go against your own human dignity, because it is this innate gift from God, our ability to reason and make decisions. So there's that part of it. The other is we have an understanding since the Second Vatican Council of religious liberty, religious freedom, that Catholicism actually respects pluralism and religious pluralism, believe it or not. And so, there is this idea that, freedom of religion means freedom, to practice one's religion, but it also means freedom from religion. And it's very heartbreaking for me to see, the Catholic Church impose its own very narrow ideology on issues of sexual health and justice and rights on the entire country, which is supposed to be founded on the separation of church and state. I'm at a convening right now of religious leaders who support abortion access, and there are several rabbis here, and they're like, this isn't you're infringing on my freedom of religion. Like, Judaism does not have this ban on abortion. And this is a major infringement on our freedom of religion and our belief. You're forcing beliefs on us. There's a real spiritual violence about this overreach. So we have that piece. And then the other piece we have in the Catholic tradition that we really lean into is our social justice tradition, which I think is the best thing about the Catholic tradition. We have beautiful writings about human dignity. And I don't know what honors what it is. Forcing someone to give birth is not honoring their human dignity. Fundamentally. And we have there's a whole framework called reproductive justice that was created by 12 Black women in 1994. And I'm happy to say some of those Black women are actually here with me at this meeting I'm at. And, it's this incredible idea that, that when someone gets pregnant, all sorts of social justice issues become very urgent suddenly. Workers' rights, the environment, whether or not one is in a violent relationship with a partner, education, right to education, right to healthcare, one of the biggest ones, economic injustice, racial injustice, all of these things become urgent. And so there's a lot of really beautiful parallels with the Catholic social justice tradition and the reproductive justice tradition. And essentially, what we're asking is that to think about, the person who is pregnant and think about their situation. Think about how being pregnant affects the entire trajectory of their lives. Everything from will they stay in a violent relationship to will they be able to feed the children they have to, are they in mortal danger because of this pregnancy? So we have these wonderful resources in our tradition, in the Catholic tradition, that we can draw upon. And it's just sad to watch the institution and these right-wing Catholics who are a minority, but extremely vocal, just say, no, it's murder, the end. There's no room for discussion, and again, the history of Catholic thinking around this simply does not support that.
Is there some way in which this is a uniquely American experience? Like the way you describe Catholicism as religious freedom, is there something about that, about being Catholic in America, that makes this so divisive?
I think so. I mean, look, and this was the rabbit hole I was threatening to go down before.
Do it.
Yeah, go.
I think there's a really important need to understand how abortion became a political issue in this country. And, the reality is, look, the Catholic Church, the United States, what is now known as the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in the 60s started to really pay attention to the liberalization of abortion laws in particular states like California, which Ronald Reagan signed, by the way, at the time, the most liberal abortion law in the country, or New York. And they started to get nervous. This was before Roe, and the church said, we're going to watch this. And they created the Right to Life League, but this was a uniquely Catholic issue. And, and most other religious traditions saw Catholics as weirdos for being so fixated on this because, mainline Protestant traditions and even evangelical traditions did not care about abortion and in fact supported abortion rights. There's writings from Dr. James Dobson, Focus on the Family, supporting it as a decision between a woman and her doctor. You had the Southern Baptist Convention signing, good Lord, I can't think of the word right now, but declarations, it's not the right word, but, in 1973, 1974, saying, that this was, an issue that was between a woman, and there's nothing in the Bible that bans abortion. Wow. And so what happens, what really happens is this has very deep white supremacist roots, is that it's called the Southern Strategy, and that, white supremacist Republicans were using a strategy to try to animate, Southern Democrats and to get them politically motivated. And because they were opposed to integration, they wanted to run segregated schools. Jerry Falwell had a segregated academy. These other guys, Oral Roberts, and all of these wanted to run these segregated academies. And that was kind of their big political cause that they would animate their base about. And then in time, of course, as the Civil Rights Act took place and all that, the IRS was like, hey, we're going to pull your tax exempt status if you keep running segregationist academies because you're violating the law. And that is when you saw evangelical Southern Baptists start to make these religious liberty claims, that this was about religious freedom. And they did this throughout the early 70s until finally it became really uncomfortable for a lot of people to start fighting, for segregationist schools. It became like unsavory at some point in the 70s for a lot of people. Like, we really can't organize around this issue anymore. So they were looking for another issue, to pivot to keep their base animated. And this is documented. You had a gentleman named Paul Weyrich, who was a Catholic and then converted to what's called the Melkite rite of the Catholic Church. And he was sort of the architect of what we now know as, the right-wing movement. And he was feeling very disenfranchised as a white cis male because he saw, Black people getting civil rights and women's liberation, and the ERA was happening, and, LGBTQ, liberation was starting. And so he was starting to feel like he was losing power. And a lot of white cis men who were, Christian white supremacists were getting, very uncomfortable. And so we need to take the power back. Weyrich is also one of the architects of banning voting rights. And so Weyrich was noticed that some Catholics were doing some good stuff with political, getting people motivated politically. And he had heard a story during midterm elections of Catholics were leafleting church parking lots, trying to be against a candidate who was pro-choice. And all of the people they leafleted about, they all won. So it was this huge political victory for anti-choice candidates. And Weyrich was just dazzled. And he was like, oh my God, this is like a respectable issue, abortion, that we can really animate our base around. And so there was a very deliberate choice by evangelicals, I will say white nationalists, Christian supremacists, white supremacist evangelicals who were feeling very under siege, that male power and white male dominance was under siege, made a decision in a conference call that they were going to pivot to abortion. And that happened in the late 1970s. And Jerry Falwell gives his first anti-choice homily sermon in 1979. Like this is like and so then you see this unholy alliance of, right-wing Catholics and evangelical Catholics using abortion again to really animate and activate their base. And then you see evangelicals get all this power, suddenly Jerry Falwell is sitting next to Reagan and, Paul Weyrich and Falwell get seats at these big political tables. And they use abortion as a litmus test. And it's come now to this moment that we're at now where abortion is the absolute litmus test for orthodoxy, for whether you're a Republican or not. We saw today what happened with Susan Collins, Senator Collins and Murkowski, that they did not go forward with the Women's Health Protection Act. Why? Because it's still that litmus test. And that all started in the 70s. So I think it's really important to realize those white supremacist, white Christian dominance, male dominance roots of this issue that, people did not care about abortion until they saw how powerful it was politically.
I love the way you connected to the white supremacy. I hadn't thought through all that as clearly as you just laid it out. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah,
Very deep dive.
No, it's beautiful, the sort of way that you make it so clear. And so I'm grateful for you sharing that, because I think this is so important, right? That this is the point that's always made about reproductive rights as well, as the people who are most affected, right? Are also those who tend to suffer the most under white supremacy, right? You can sort of see the link where it's still a feedback loop in both directions, right? And I want to remind our audience that if you have questions, please do put those in the chat. But I actually wondered if you could say a little bit more, because this is a series on faith and culture, and I heard this, right? But you talked about it being the litmus test, but you also used the word orthodoxy for Republicans, right? And so can you talk to me a bit about how you understand it, particularly around reproductive rights and this issue, the ways in which the political and the religious work for you as a culture, right? Like separately, and the way that they get meshed together for others in the right.
Could you say a little more?
Well, because, I'm sort of thinking on my feet here, because I think what I'm trying to think about, right, is the very idea of orthodoxy, in some ways, right? And the idea of a litmus test is a particular way of engaging either your political location or your religion, but that there are also people who see themselves as politically active and religious who would not want to do that. And I think you had mentioned earlier, especially sort of Vatican II and the sort of right to pluralism that's missing here. So like what happens to, I'm interested sort of you as an American Catholic, and there are lots of American Catholics like you, even if they're not the ones heard, but also like what happens to capital A American Catholicism under the sort of bishops? Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like there are two very different narratives about what constitutes orthodoxy.
Gotcha.
Does that help answer?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I have to give you some statistics to frame this, which is that 68% of Catholics in this country do not want to see Roe versus Wade struck down. Yeah. And I think that's more than the general American public. I think the American public is like 65 and Catholics are like 68. This is true also of same-sex marriage for many years as well. Catholics have always been ahead of the curve on that as well. 50 now, according to PRRI the other day, 59% of Catholics think abortion should be legal in all or most cases. And so, we are in a very different place from the US bishops who have such a hard line, so extreme that they were threatening to, deny communion to President Biden, and they're constantly threatening Nancy Pelosi as well, who are very faithful Catholics of a certain generation, to whom having access to the Eucharist is very, very important to them. and to use it as this tool of political intimidation, the cynicism of this, I think was really devastating to a lot of Catholics. And we were at Catholics for Choice, were very much a very vocal part of that debate. And what surprised us the most, and we had polling to support this, but to see it actually play out, was that even moderate Catholics, even Republican Catholics, for them, that was a line, like, you don't mess with the Eucharist, and so it was an extremely unpopular position to take. And, the bishop, I was one of the first times, well, two things happened. First of all, you saw the US bishops completely go rogue with the Vatican, because the Vatican was saying, no, please don't do this. This is a global thing that we need to make as brother bishops. This is like we're a global church, and we need to make these decisions together. Please don't go rogue. But they went rogue anyway. So that was the first time I think anyone had seen, a conference of bishops from one country just like totally split with the Vatican. And so, you saw that happen. And it was the first time I'd seen that. It was also the first time I'd seen the bishops back down. Because the outcry, even from the middle of the church, and even from some on the more right of the church, was just like, no, you've gone too far now. And so it really put, I think, in stark relief how the US bishops do not represent the convictions of American Catholics. There is a chasm between us, and it's very sad, because Catholicism still means a lot to a lot of people. And I think of my mother a lot, who loves Catholicism, loves to go pray the rosary, loves to go, light a candle in the church, but will not go to church during Mass because she doesn't want to hear, her daughter, who is a lesbian, she doesn't want to hear hate speech about me. And my love. And so, some Catholics on the abortion issue will say, well, when you say 68% don't want to see Roe, it's all Catholics. It's not Catholics that go to Mass every week. And what I say to that is, but what does it mean to participate in the life of the church? Is my mother not participating in the life of the church? It's not her fault that she doesn't want to hear hate speech about her daughter, when she goes to Mass, but she still is participating. And so I think that that's a really important thing too, is that, this faith really means a lot to people. And there's they feel, profoundly, wounded by the faith, and they wouldn't feel those wounds so deeply if it didn't mean that much to them.
Yeah, well, and just as a quick follow-up, like, it's so interesting because, this is a sort of signal thing, the historian in me, like, about Catholicism, is it has always been this very deep and rich tradition, and this very embodied tradition, right? That there are multiple rituals and there are multiple ways of sort of engaging, and this emphasis on, well, if you aren't at the Mass to hear the sermon, this sort of emphasis on the word is a very Reformed, post-Reformed Protestant sort of, like, only in America is the Catholic worried about if they got the word in that way,
Yes, gosh, that is a profound insight, I think. And there is this really, I alluded to this earlier, but there is this real Calvinist streak in right-wing Catholics that I find fascinating. Because there's no space for grace in these people's lives. They live in this black and white universe that, as I said earlier, just is not consistent with the Catholic tradition. We really have a theology of co-creation with God. It's one of the reasons I've stayed Catholic. My classes in Karl Barth made me want to stay Catholic, quite honestly, at Yale. And I was like, oh God, this is grim. And my professor, Margaret Farley, used to say, if you think Catholic guilt is bad, try Protestant guilt. I always loved that line.
Yeah.
Because it was this idea that is in these right-wing Catholics' minds of just like total depravity of the human person. And that is just not Catholic. We really do think that we are innately good because God is good and God creates good things. And, and though we sin and we're fallen and all of that, we're in this very dynamic relationship with God in which God is constantly offering grace to us, and we take it or we don't take it. But there is this, again, grace perfecting nature idea that is not what you see in this sort of uniquely American Calvinistic Catholicism.
Yeah, and I will just say that I wonder if that doesn't have, and then I'm going to let Dave talk, I'm sorry, but the history dork in me, I wonder if it doesn't have like Puritan roots too in particular, right? Because I work at a PCUSA seminary, right? And they're very clear that their sort of brand of Calvinism, there is this very like, we are broken, we are sinful creatures, but they very much lean heavily on this notion of grace in this dynamic sort of similar way that you're talking about, right? So that like, just like any other part of the Christian tradition, you can sort of read Calvin two ways and you can pick up the worst parts or the best parts.
Yeah.
And the Puritans were like, we're all awful and we're going to burn witches, right? And like, I just feel like that is so deep in American and the ways in which Puritans were implicated ultimately in white supremacy that I wonder if that's undergirding, that it's not even named, because we don't have Puritans really floating around anymore, but it just like, it's in the water, as it were.
We do have Puritan sensibilities, though. We really, really do. And I'm glad you're naming that about PCUSA. I dated a number of Presbyterians who are now Presbyterian ministers when I was at Yale.
Yes.
And they were all had this understanding of grace, and I often say, you don't Catholic, just because you're baptized Catholic does not mean you have that understanding of grace. And if you're baptized Protestant, you're not a Calvinist, but we're seeing these streaks, that you're naming of Puritanism. And I think it is, I was in a relationship for a long time with someone who's grew up evangelical in Grand Rapids. So it's like the real Calvinist, evangelicalism in Grand Rapids. Fascinating place. We're still very good friends. We're not together anymore, but we're still very good friends. And one thing that struck me, because her family was so Calvinist evangelical, was they were obsessed with really like awful murder shows, like cold case files, and these just things that I think Americans are very obsessed with, because it reinforces the notion of total depravity and fallen humanity. And I having gone through so much of these shows, and like, what is it about their Calvinist, like evangelicalism, and this fixation on these very dark shows, very bleak shows, bleak about humanity. And I think that I think there is something really innate that a lot of Americans really gravitate toward that programming, because it reinforces this idea, Anyway, I did not expect to talk about that, but
it's great.
You triggered it in me.
Yes.
Jamie, you said a moment ago that you heard a calling to become a priest.
Yes.
I'm wondering, in the distance that you've traveled from that moment as a child till today as an adult doing the work you're doing, do you feel like you've fulfilled any of that calling?
Well, I certainly fulfilled all the academic requirements. I did the degrees, I did the pastoral ministries, I did all of the things. But I think that I was 12 years as a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, and I felt like that was a ministry of the word. I really did, and the way in which I named things for Catholics on the edge, I think, was really important. And I do think this is a form of ministry. I believe God put me in this role at this particular time, and I think it is just constantly, reading the signs of the times and following the Spirit. And the reason I do this work is because people are suffering. I mean, that's the heart of why I do the work I do, because I've seen and I know the suffering that's happening because of abortion bans. And I know the suffering that is to come, if the Supreme Court goes the way it seems to be. And I can't bear it. And what I really can't bear, it's being done in the name of my faith, and I just want to say, not in our name will you cause this suffering, and so, yeah, I do think, I think it is, it is my vocation. I think that it's always been a nevertheless, I persisted, and it's always God calling me and bringing me into all sorts of new things. And so, yeah, I don't really, I used to be more involved with sort of these marginalized Catholic communities in New York, and because I had more time, and I would preach, and I would even consecrate the Eucharist with these communities. They were LGBTQ Catholic communities, and it was great, and I loved it. And I never felt so alive as when I give out the Eucharist. Right now, my time is so consumed with this work, but I appreciate that, that question. And I do think, it is my vocation. It's God's calling me to this particular moment, I think.
I kind of knew the answer before I asked it, but I wanted to see the way you'd say it, simply because you had this, you spoke about this really wonderfully inclusive vision of God loving all people earlier.
Yeah.
That was what you heard, and since you've been speaking on different topics, you keep bringing that up about, you cite the traditions, you cite the theologians, and it's clear that it's there. And I grew up Catholic as well, and an Italian family as well, and I understand uh, a little bit where you're coming from
Yeah.
with that stuff. I sense something majestic in that tradition that was beautiful and universal. Like you're describing with so many people who are in those statistics, the 60% or so or more, who don't agree with so many of these teachings. I always found it hard to reconcile that side of the church. And so I admire you. I want to just kind of give you kudos for doing the work you're doing as a Catholic, maintaining your faith and sticking up for the inclusivity and the beauty of it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. I think sometimes I'm just a masochist, I fear, but but you know, I don't think it's an accident that this all started with a calling to the priesthood, because it really opened my eyes to the deep belief that women are not equal to men in the Catholic Church. And that's the root of all of these. That's the root of the teaching on contraception. That's the root of the teaching on abortion. That's the root of the teaching on, you know, a ban on same-sex relationships. It's all about profound misogyny and the idea that this is what God wants, that, you know, that God wants women to essentially be mothers. Like, that is our most essential vocation. And, you know, we have these pretty ideas like feminine genius, but I mean, what Pope John Paul II is saying, there's our uteruses. I mean, that's our gift to the world, you know, and so it doesn't surprise me that seeing that, experiencing being seen as not valid and not legitimate when I knew God was calling me to this thing really shaped me, I think. Just the profound injustice of that. And in time, seeing that that was at the root of all of these profoundly harmful teachings that disaffect so many Catholics who otherwise really want to enjoy the richness of the sacramental and social justice tradition of this faith.
Yes. So we have a question in the chat. Can you talk about your journey on how you're able to stand in your power and speak this truth? So Reverend Dupree heads us here at St. Paul's, and it's his, and so he says it's very brave. So if you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, foolish and brave.
Well, fan.
You know, I have this incorrigible belief that I'm right. And so I mean, maybe it's insanity. I don't know. People often use this quote about Einstein. There's so many times you can bang your head against the wall and, you know, nothing changes or whatever. But I really do have this incorrigible belief I'm right. And that again, there is something so beautiful and good about this tradition that you almost want to fight for the soul of it. You know, and you know, I'm not ashamed to want power in this church. You know, I think we've, you know, brought shame upon that, but I don't think there's any more shame of a woman wanting power in the church than there is for, you know, a Black person wanting power, you know, in society and in politics and all of that. I think that, you know, that there's a very patriarchal idea that, you know, of shaming anyone that doesn't have power for wanting power, you know, and I really want to break that. So yeah, I think that's it. You know, I just feel compelled. I really do. I don't, it's really kind of a mystery to me, but that God keeps opening up opportunities for me to do this work. That I say, okay, I guess that's what I'm supposed to do. And, you know, I somehow find that power, you know, from this place of authority that my church has told me I do not have, you know, but somehow I find it. And again, I'm really motivated by the suffering. I really, really am. That happens, and I can't bear it, you know, to see the harm that this institution is doing to vulnerable people, particularly, you know. And I think that's what kills me, is it's always the most vulnerable, or the people who are already so crucified by racism and by, you know, economic injustice, and you know, that suffer the most in these ideological battles. And it breaks my heart, and it makes me angry. And so I keep going. As long as God keeps opening up opportunities for me to do the work, I just keep going.
Well, and if I can just say quickly, like, it was so powerful listening to you and thinking about the very definition that's implied in power when we shame people for wanting power, yes. Right? Which is that implicitly power is a bad thing, right? And you're going to do bad things with power because that's what I'm doing with my power.
Yes.
And the very fact that the suffering, right? You want the power to stop the suffering instead of causing the suffering. I mean, that's just a beautifully powerful way to live your life.
Yeah. I think we have to really rethink what we mean by power. We have a whole new definition of it, and it's throughout the gospel. We talk about Jesus' power, right? And and to really, rethink that as coming from a place of one's deepest, most being and authority, given by God. So it doesn't always mean you're going to, abuse, but I think we've seen so many horrible abuses of power, especially by clerical figures, that it's good. We really have to think deeply and rethink what it means.
Yes, absolutely.
Christine, we got another question in the chat.
Yeah.
You want me to read it, or you want to do it?
You go ahead. I did the last
one. Okay. All right. It says here about Amy Coney Barrett's membership in the People of Praise organization.
Yes.
I'm trying to flick back. Okay, hold on.
I can't remember the name of that group the other day. I'm glad somebody's reminding me.
The question reads like, much was made of AC Barrett's membership in People of Praise during her confirmation hearings, downplayed by advocates. In retrospect, is this an organization that exerts powerful influence in banning reproductive rights? Are there others we should know about?
Yeah, absolutely. The People of Praise thing is so interesting because it's a I would call it a cult within this church. There's a number of cults within the Catholic Church, and I think it's one of them, in which they really did practice this idea of gender complementarity. And I think men were called heads, and women were literally called handmaidens. They say now they changed that lingo, inside the group, but whatever, they said what they said. It tells you everything, because there is that idea, and that this is what God wants, is that men are meant to be in authority and have the power, and women are meant to be of service. And this is this gender complementarity, this very rigid understanding of gender roles that really powers the Catholic Church, powers all of its political influences. And so people often ask me with Amy Coney Barrett, like, yeah, but she's so powerful. She's a Supreme Court justice. Like, it couldn't be that bad. And I'm like, yeah, but she's so adjacent to male power, and she benefits from male power, and I would even venture to say she's a soldier in the army of the patriarchy. But and I think that's so important to name. And I'm saying that for a reason. Because this has been there are organizations. I think the two big organizations that I think progressives have fallen asleep on were the Federalist Society and the Becket Fund. And these are both organizations founded by Catholics and run by Catholics and powered by Catholics. Federalist Society is Leonard Leo. I can't remember who started the Becket Fund, but the Becket Fund are the legal team that is always in the Supreme Court, fighting for like the Little Sisters of the Poor, fighting for that Catholic charity that didn't want LGBTQ couples to adopt, and they always win. It's very infuriating, but they're always pushing these religious liberty cases that get us to the next point, that keep this overreach getting more and more and more extreme. And so I think that's, and it's a long game, and it's been a very concerted effort and very, very well planned out, really to pack the courts with their people. And so when this horrible thing happened, that Trump got to nominate 3 Supreme Court justices, it wasn't an accident that those were Catholics, and those were hard right-wing Catholics. So this has been a long game, and unfortunately they have won. But so when I say it's this overreach by the Catholicism, it's like they created the ideology, this whole idea that life begins at conception, and these notions of personhood. These are all Catholic ideological ideas, these bans on contraception, bans on abortion, but also the way in which they politically maneuvered, is what's gotten us to this point.
Absolutely. So there's another question in the chat that I think sort of follows on this nicely. It says, it strikes me that a lot more conservative Catholics wouldn't see themselves in quite the light that you characterize them. For example, as thinking women are less worthy than men, using hate speech, et cetera. Sort of this Amy, conversation we we're just having. What do you think is the best way to create dialogue within the church? This seems very important to me in light of the fact that the church is one of the few places left where people are left on opposite sides of the political aisle might still have deeper common identity and shared ethical tradition. So the shared identity and ethical tradition might create room for overcoming political polarization that is so deep and rampant in other parts of society.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that question. And when hate speech is pretty exaggerated, but these are exaggerated times. What I mean is when they say, your love is not blessed by God, your love is not worthy, of heterosexual love. It's, that it's somehow sinful. And so that just feels like, hate to me, as a person in the same-sex relationship. And so, but I think the question is a really good one. And I will be the first to say that I think the pro-choice movement has really come up short in its messaging, in the way it's talked. It obviously has not moved people, and I think that we have to start really having deep conversations with a certain level of humility and openness that has not been the mark of the pro-choice movement. And one of the struggles I have is that we're a faith-based pro-choice organization, and the big repro organizations don't really respect faith. And what I say to them all the time, because I do get to be at tables with the leaders of these organizations, it's like, you're fighting a movement that claims to be religious. Mm-hmm. You're fighting, the anti-choice movement is religious. And you need the language of faith, and you need people of faith to talk back and say, this has nothing to do with religion, but it does. And this is, I think, where to the extent it has to do with religion and morality. I think where the pro-choice movement has come up short is, the experience of pregnancy, and that, we do assign value to the fetus. Whether as a human becoming, does the fetus deserve equal rights to the childbearer? I don't think so. But to just, have what can be interpreted as a very cavalier approach has done us no favors. And so, I think that we have to do deep listening, and it's going to be a very long game for us to engage people in dialogue. And so, there is a very hard right anti-choice movement that I don't think you can dialogue with, but there are people who just don't know how they feel, and they have been so disenchanted with the polarization, and they don't feel like they fit in either camp. And those are the people we're interested in at Catholics for Choice, in encountering and giving them education and information so that they can do their own moral discernment. Like, I'm not here to tell, especially when I deal with progressive Catholics who don't know how they know how they feel about immigration and economic justice and, all of these, really, or, the environment and all of that, but they don't know how they feel about abortion because it is so taboo and so stigmatized in the Catholic Church. When I talk to them, I'm like, I'm going to give you information to help you with your moral discernment. I am not here to tell you how to think. But there is so much stigma around abortion, particularly for Catholics, that they don't know much. And so you really have to start with just that basic education. And so we've been doing that work, and it's been very, very gratifying for me. Because as a faith-based organization, we can say different things, and we need to do different things. And I really want to do that encounter and engagement. I think that the person asking the question is talking about. And so I really appreciate that. It's the only way we're going to move the needle,
What's interesting about that, Jamie, is that, like you said, in the statistics you quoted earlier, the majority of Catholics and the majority of Americans favor some kind of freedom for choice. Mm-hmm. And so you're right that the pro-choice movement hasn't grabbed a moral narrative with the experience of birth and all these other issues, but for some reason, the majority have still gotten the message. Yep. Whatever the story is that they're plugging into, or whatever it is, the values, that they want this option. And so I don't know why that is. It's something about maybe just the way people get their messages rhetorically, how it comes to them, and what they know. What they know, what they can understand.
Well, but like who they know. The number of us, all of us know at least one person who's had to have an abortion under some of these more extreme definitions, especially. Anybody who I've ever talked to, like who's experienced someone having to make those hard choices for any number of reasons, right? Doesn't matter what the narrative is. If they actually have a narrative to it that's personal, that we don't speak out loud, then it's much harder to be in the anti-choice camp.
Exactly. And what's so important, the next statistic and the final one is that 1 in 4 abortion patients in this country identifies as Catholic. Yep. And what that means, that abortion is part of the life of the church. You know,
Ooh.
it's the woman in the pew next to you. It's the person who's giving out the Eucharist. It's the woman who's mending the priest's vestments and washing his dishes, are having abortions. And you're just going to say they're murderers. Like, there's a real pastoral crisis going on here. And I think that it is part of the life of the church, and the you know, the institution is in terrible denial about it at great cost of I think spiritual violence to the church. And I think that could be a part of why also, you know, a lot of Catholics are having abortions at the same rate as every other person in the US. And I think that, you know, abortion is something that they get hit over the head with all the time, you know, in their churches. And I think that there's also a part of that's a lot of the reason people leave the church is they're tired of hearing this rhetoric, you know, that doesn't, again, you know, that we're being led by men who are ostensibly celibate, you know, who have no inroads into the life of women. They don't have wives, they don't have daughters, they live in very highly male environments, and they are, you know, trying to, you know, tell people how to use their, you know, women how to use their fertility, and explain what, you know, what it's like, you know, to have a family and to have children, and they have absolutely no inroads to this life. And I think that also really is disenchanting for a lot of Catholics.
I think like the other issues you raised with contraception, women as priests, same-sex unions, and so on. I think what's happening is that there's a real rush to certainty. There's a desire for authority and certainty linked together amongst the ones you're characterizing who are making that policy, and their discomfort with the gray area is really what's showing. Like, you know, you just shared, so many people are ambivalent or confused, or they want to think through the story of what it is that's happening when somebody needs to consider their health and their choices with having a baby. And we all know people that have been through that, and it is a messy, complicated, story-driven process. But a lot of this rhetoric comes at us that forces us into a more narrow, off on good, bad judgment. And I think the way you characterized the bishops earlier, how they came at this and how dogmatic, and I'm kind of curious. This is a political what if question. How long, Jamie? How long do you think that'll last? That they can continue to produce the hardline opposition to, what was it, 65% or more? I mean, 1 in 4 Catholics, if that was the number you gave, that's a huge number. There's a lot of Catholics in America.
Catholics,
That's a lot of Catholics.
Millions.
Really out of touch position.
It is. Unfortunately, Dave, they're winning. And so as long as they're winning in the courts, they're winning, you know, in the way in which they're manipulating Republican politicians. And so as long as they keep having these political wins and these legal wins, I don't think that they're, you know, I think, you know, they'd rather, I think they're desperate to have that influence because they lost so much influence among their own people, you know, that I think there's a fulfillment for some of these bishops, you know, to feel influential, unfortunately. So I don't know, you know, it reminds me of Pope Benedict XVI's idea of having a smaller, purer church, preferring a smaller, purer church, you know, which isn't Pope Francis's vision, but it's still that mindset is very much in the US bishops, very much a presence in their minds.
Absolutely.
I just don't see them feeling any consequence for it. I guess I wish I could see that.
Yeah, me too, for a lot of issues.
Yeah. So just a real quick, one more question in the chat. This will be the final one, just because I think it's a sort of quick and we've sort of touched on it, but if you could just say a bit more about how the evangelical church is now working with Catholics, because, you know, it used to be the case 50 years ago, there was lots of distrust of Catholics. But like now they seem to be working much more closely with Catholics who are pro-life, or our commenter's preferred term, pro-birth.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that started in the late 70s. I mean, again, the evangelicals got the idea of using abortion as a activating political tool from Catholics. They saw the political success of it. And so that's really when that started. And it's been fascinating. I remember when there was, you know, Proposition 8, you know, banning same-sex marriage in California. And you saw the Mormons and the Catholics get together. And that was just astonishing because the Mormons, cool. And I know my partner, I know this for a fact, my partner is a very famous excommunicated Mormon. You know, they call the Catholic Church the great and abominable church.
Yep.
I mean, that is how we are known. Like they don't even say Catholic, they say great and abominable. And to see them get into this unholy alliance, you know, Catholics and Mormons just united against a common hate of same-sex love, you know, was just astonishing. And you know, they made a decision. They signed this Manhattan Declaration back in 2010, Catholics, evangelicals, Mormons, and they decided that they were going to be, you know, in union with each other, making these religious liberty claims. And that's, I'm one of the few people at the time that read the Manhattan Declaration and was like, oh God, that's why, you know, I sounded the alarm according to my bio.
Yes.
You know, and so this has been a very deliberate, concerted effort by these, what I consider hard right, you know, religious organizations to really be in partnership together to push this political agenda, you know, all on the claim that their rights are being infringed upon. But, you know, right-wing movements always thrive on these narratives of being under siege, you know, and being threatened. And, you know, I love it when Catholics and evangelicals who are so powerful, you have this white male dominant power and so much money are always under siege, you know, and under threat. But that's the fuel for that movement. So.
Absolutely. Well, I will just say thank you so much for taking time to talk with us this evening. I know that you are very busy, far busier than we originally asked you, unfortunately, but we are grateful for you out there doing the very important work that you're doing, and for taking time to talk to us and to our audience this evening. So I know that we asked you if you would pray for us or bless us. So I'm hoping you can do that in just a minute, but Dave needs to make an announcement real quick. I got you.
Commercials.
I didn't want to forget that because I know Jamie has to leave.
No.
But we have all of you have been listening to not just tonight's program, but the series Faith and Culture. There is a survey email link to a survey about this series in your email. So if you could go fill that out at your leisure, we would much appreciate it as Christine, Kelly, and I imagine next year's programming.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank you all for the invitation. We were slightly different climate when this invitation came. But, you know, as I said to Christy and to Kelly earlier, you know, I will never get this invitation from my own church to speak to a parish or to a Catholic community. And it just means the world to me when a religious community invites me in to speak. So it gives me a sense of having a place in the church somehow. So I want to thank you for this opportunity. And yeah, let me just say this prayer. So, okay, I'm gonna pray. Okay, I gotta pray. I gotta center. We pray into this moment that in our work for reproductive freedom, we will always listen to the stirrings of the Spirit within us. May we show kindness and compassion to our partners and our co-conspirators and earn the respect of those we fight for. God of wisdom, may we not be consumed by the anger and violence that we confront in this work. And instead, may we show courage when we are afraid and care for one another when we are in conflict. God of abundance, we know the road ahead is long. May we find joy in the struggle and be at peace if we do not achieve our dreams in our lifetime. Amen.
Amen.